Good to go. Evening. So it's wonderful to be back again. We're at the end of week 2, and we see a lot of you online. I am Aromar Revi. Some of us have met before, and I guess a lot of us are going to get to know each other much better over this hour that we have. So very quickly, in week 2, we've been looking at how the city functions. So it's a fairly broad introduction to how cities actually work in different parts of the world, but we've chosen to take 2 cities. One is London, the capital of the United Kingdom, and Mumbai, which is the financial capital of India. These 2 cities have been tied together over at least a few hundred years in terms of their development, and we use that as a device to be able to compare how cities actually function in different parts of the world. So we first looked at governance in the abstract context, and then of course within the city itself. And then we looked at planning and land management, which my colleague Raf Toots, who heads that function, is a very senior functionary at UN Habitat in Nairobi, looked at in sort of 2 different sessions. And then we moved on to urban services, different kinds of services, how they actually function, how they worked, both environmental services and other services like energy, transportation, and ICT. And then, of course, we looked at how we can actually finance these processes. How do cities actually get financed, especially from the public side? And where does one raise the taxes from? And how does this sort of all tie together? Because without the money, in some senses, this doesn't work in many parts of the world. And finally, we looked at a very hard and interesting question, and that is what really helps make cities sustainable at a very fundamental level, and where do they actually break down? What, in which context does breakdown take place, and how can you avoid that? So we looked at law, order, and conflict in the final session. So a fairly sort of wide range of different questions that we're looking at, and this is a sort of a pattern that we're going to use. Plus, of course, I think there's been a lot of activity on the community fora over yesterday and today to try and see how we can move into the next week. In the next week, we'll give you time to try and catch up, talk to each other, and set up this sort of what we think is going to be a very fun set of exercises in different parts of the world, where people are starting to look at their own urban environments and try and engage with them, and try and sort of tie down some of these ideas that we're talking about in a particular context. I mean, that's the important thing here. A number of you are asking very specific questions that would actually be part of a master's course around planning or financing or governance or a whole range of other things. The first thing, of course, is that many of these questions will be dealt with over the course of the next many weeks. So one has to be a little patient. I know these questions are interesting and exciting. We'll try and respond to them as quickly as we can in the current context. But some of them are too specific for me to address, or for all of us to address in this particular sort of set of sessions. So we will try and pick up things that are applicable to a whole range of you across the world, and specifically within certain urban contexts, because like we've tried to sort of stress earlier, we need to, in the SDGs, in the process of developing sustainable cities, address questions of daily life, address questions of particular neighborhoods, address questions of particular cities. The interesting thing about the theory that goes behind this is it allows you to take the experience of one place and then try and look at how it can be applied to another context or scale beyond that particular context. So the theory is important, but the real thing for us is to try and see, since many of you are practitioners, of how we can apply it in a particular context. So I'm going to be responding broadly to the more general questions rather than the more specific ones. The more technical questions, I guess some of us will respond to as much as we can on the community fora. So if you've got specific questions, we'll try and respond to them. We'll also try and link you up to particular resources. And of course, the great thing about having so many thousands of people on this course is that you can add on from your experience, whether it's from Latin America or from Africa or from Europe or North America or from Asia. And that cross-learning is actually very, very rich and interesting. There are many things that I would have not had any experience of, that some of you have actually done things or are engaged in either research or practice or actually managing governments would actually provide us with. So we're expecting a lot from you in this, and I think that's what the most exciting thing of having such a diverse set of people on this course as possible. So let me start responding to some of the questions that are coming up. Shubhika, you asked a question about how one needs to look at cities holistically to try and understand its complexities. Now, the thing, of course, is in this area, there aren't too many sort of all-encompassing readings that would address these questions. But if you have access to the internet and you have access to a journal called Environment and Urbanization, it's an open access journal. It's actually run by a colleague and friend, David Satterthwaite, who's the editor. You'll find a whole range of articles in Environment and Urbanization, which will start addressing the question of holism in cities and how you can address them. And you'll find that for the last 25 years, so you'll get a very interesting cross-section. And you have very interesting people who've written it. So the former president of Brazil, President Lula, well before he was a president, actually published an article in this journal. So that's a good journal to actually sort of reach out to and try and understand. I wouldn't want to sort of recommend a single book, because this is an emerging area, and what we're talking about here is stuff that hasn't been written about too much and isn't a particular book. So we're going to give you lots of readings to access, and I guess what you're going to be learning from is not only what we're dealing with in this session, but also with your other colleagues. Dhamika, now you've asked a very important question. How feasible is it to achieve sustainable cities unless we develop the periphery and the suburbs? I think I've said this earlier in the last webcast, if you were there. See, the city and the countryside are a construction. These are ideas that we have, which are useful as categories, but in actual practice, they're not very useful in practice. So especially when you try and polarize one from the other. These are continua, especially in many parts of the world, even in parts of the world that are highly urbanized, like, let's say, Europe and North America. So the question of the periphery and where the borders of the urban area or the city actually ends is something that's, it's a deep question. There are no sort of comparable sort of systems across the world where you have one particular definition, etc. So of course the peripheries are very, very critical, and they're critical for a number of reasons. The first and the most important reason is that cities are not isolated places. They're part of what we call open systems. There are a lot of things that flow back and forth. Cities don't produce most of their food. Much of their water comes from areas around them. And of course, their air pollution, for example, and other forms of pollution impact the areas around them. And of course, if you're a downstream village or a city from a river which flows through a large city like we have seen in China and of course in South Asia, you sometimes are in deep problems. So we need to look at it in a holistic manner, in a systematic manner. And even the idea of suburbanization is increasingly being questioned over the last 10 or 15 years. There is one school of thought that talks about trying to enable the compact city that works in some locations, that doesn't work in every part of the world. And the fact that suburbanization, first driven by 19th century technologies like, let's say, the tram car or the railway, in the case of a city like London that we talk about in the first couple of lectures, helped the development of peripheral areas because land prices were high in the city, and of course it became cheaper to live outside. And then of course in particular countries, there is a value given to rural life. In England, of course, that was certainly true in a lot of the 19th and the early 20th century, leading to the development of garden cities and peripheralization. Now the challenge is that when you combine a mix of a whole range of people with different income classes and a sort of land market that's not very equitable, along with the motor car or some other transportation system that sort of increases the gradient outside cities, you get sprawl. And sprawl has created a whole range of social, ecological, and economic challenges. Out of the whole process of sprawl in North American cities, you got the hollowing out of the city center, where during the day people would come in and they would work in offices because the land uses were segregated, and then at the end of the day, you would find that the center was hollow. It was taken over by crime. Most people moved out of those areas. But we've seen in the urban renewal movement starting in the 60s and the 70s, and now continuing in many parts of the world, that you can actually revitalize the center of cities, and they're actually exceedingly interesting places to live in. If you look at a city like Melbourne, which had this problem, let's say 15 or 20 years ago with the suburbanization in Australia, you find now with the pedestrianization of the heart of the city free transportation, trams that are functioning in the city, and a very active city life that goes, late into the night, a lot of younger people and sometimes older people actually moving back into the city center. So this idea of periphery and suburbs is sometimes a problematic one, and the way that it's sort of driven the death of the inner city areas is something that's of significant concern. And the car is not an inevitability. In fact, I was in Marrakesh, let's say about a week or so ago, and there was a sort of fairly strong statement made by Jeffrey Sachs, who's going to come on later into this course, where he said that he would be really surprised if by the 2025s and 2030s in many parts of the world, the motor car, or let's say the internal combustion driven motor car, is the dominant form of transportation. So part of that is because of disintermediation that's caused by these new aggregators, but also the transition that we have to make into electric vehicles. And the question for us again is, how will that influence urbanization? How can we sort of increase urban densities and try and sort of bring back both life and culture and of course economic activity into the heart of the city? So there's a subsidiary question, I guess, that you have there about how does one maintain population density within the city core? And I guess there are many ways to do this, but fundamentally, the city core has to be a place that's alive, both economically and socially. It has to be safe. And I think all the great cities, or the more sort of livable cities of the world, have actually done this by making the inner city pedestrian and walkable, increasing densities of occupation, and in some cases redeveloping areas so you have increasing densities, having public transportation so it's easy to get back and forth, whether it's Vienna or, like I was just mentioning, Melbourne at the moment, or many parts of Vancouver, and even in cities like Singapore in Southeast Asia. That's a movement that we're seeing to increase the engagement of people with the city. And they are some things that may be sort of counterintuitive. Having street hawkers, having informality in the streets is actually a very good way to make this happen, because people feel safe, families come out and they can spend time outside. Streets are not only used for cars, they're used for a whole range of other processes. And you can see that in many parts of the world, including in Latin America, like in Brazil and sometimes in Colombia, where for certain parts of the week, the center of the city is actually closed down, and it becomes actually available and safe for families and young people and a whole range of other older people to actually travel in. And we've seen this again and again in many parts of the world. Copenhagen was a classic example where pedestrianization actually completely transformed the inner part of the city. And I think doing that even in sort of cities in low and middle income countries which are growing very rapidly is a very effective way of moving forward. Avantika, you have a question about the wealth of the common people that goes into tax and whether that should be efficiently utilized in building public infrastructure. Yes, of course. So the thing, of course, is that when you govern an urban system, infrastructure is only one element. If you've gone through the session that I led you through, infrastructure is only one element that you need to deal with. There are a whole range of other public services. So it would be a little problematic if you put all the money into public infrastructure and you actually did not put money into policing and law and order. So the city would actually have very good infrastructure, but it would be very unsafe. So the challenge for us is to look at the range of services that need to be provided by public agencies. Not all of them need to be provided. In fact, that's what that session was about, trying to understand which of the core services need to be provided by the public systems, which can be provided by communities, and some things are very, best done by communities. For example, childcare in many parts of the world would be not so well done by public systems. Of course, in places like Sweden, it's done by, by an extension of public services. But in other places, communities are quite happy to deal with these kind of questions. Some of them are best done by private providers. In many parts of the world, I would say in most parts of the world, the extension of telecommunications, cell phones, and the internet has been done dramatically well by public agencies. So by private providers, sorry. And public agencies have been somewhat slower to actually and less efficient in dealing with that. So there's a mix of different providers that are required to build up infrastructure, some public, some private, and some community-based. Let's say taxation helps manage a system that provides those services, some of them that are common and can only be provided by government, and B, of course, they also help provide the governance frame that enables the management of that. So, for example, if you want to manage a good public internet infrastructure, one way of doing it, of course, is to have a public monopoly and essentially fund it through public funds. The other way that's proved very effective in many parts of the world is to bring in a whole range of private providers, provide them licenses, and set up a frame in which they're actually able to compete with each other very effectively. I mean, that's what India has done after some sort of challenges initially in that process in the 1990s, and we effectively have some of the lowest rates for internet access and for phone and digital communication access in the world. So setting up the ability to manage that process, to license, to be able to manage those utilities, create the market, is also an important one. And that is actually a very effective way of government tax, because in many parts of the world, in many contexts, the government shouldn't do everything, and then a whole range of things the government should effectively be involved in. There's also a question about about how does medium-sized cities be seen as growth magnets. Now, this is not only true of India, but we call these medium-sized cities. In fact, actually, maybe I should make a clarification. There was a very interesting point made about us using urban areas and cities interchangeably. Now, in a formal sense, and David Satterthwaite has written about this, he'll be speaking about this maybe a little bit later in the course, is that cities are larger urban centers, and different countries have different definitions of them. Typically, they would be above 100,000 or 500,000, in some cases a million, depending on how you look at them. The United Nations actually connects data for cities that are about 750,000 and above, etc. So those are cities, and then you have urban areas, and urban areas can go from very large villages in some parts of the world. So large villages in a country like India of 10,000 and above would actually be counted as small towns, let's say in countries that are less inhabited, like Finland, or let's say Norway, or other countries like that. So you have an entire continuum from large villages, really small towns, to medium-sized towns. So here we're talking about what we call secondary cities, as medium-sized cities, sometimes from a size of about 50,000 in some countries, to let's say about 500,000 in others. It depends on how quickly they grow. So of course they're very important in the overall settlement structure and framework, in terms of territorial development, because in many parts of the world, the bulk of the population does live in these smaller secondary cities. Now, the challenge, of course, is you have to see them as part of the continuum, as part of the system, and because large metropolitan centers tend to attract both investment and resources, and of course young people in some parts of the world, medium-sized and secondary cities tend to get left out. Now, the position that many of us have taken on this is that if we really have to achieve the SDGs in the next 10 or 15 years, secondary cities are very critical for at least 3 reasons. The first one is their size and scale is enough, is not large, so we can actually address them effectively and rather quickly. It's very difficult to deal with a large metropolitan region with overlapping jurisdictions, a whole range of other processes that are happening there. So the scale and size are manageable. The second thing about secondary cities are that a lot of the infrastructure and housing, especially in the global south, have still to be built. So if you go in and you are able to plan effectively, invest effectively, mobilize effectively, you can actually do a lot very quickly, and you can transform them much quicker than larger metropolitan centers. If you take a city like London or New York or even Buenos Aires, they have infrastructure that was built starting in the late 19th century. To actually sort of rebuild them, to reinvest in them is actually exceedingly difficult. It takes time, effort, and energy, and people in the city are not very happy because it interrupts their work. It makes things quite complex for them in terms of urban management. So secondary cities have a lot of opportunity. Plus, they have a long way to go in terms of employment generation and impact for growth. The question, of course, is that they have to be tied together, and they have to be tied together with larger metropolitan centers to be part of this sort of global process of urbanization that we are seeing, that are quite important, at least economically. The third challenge, of course, is that many of them do not have adequate institutional capacities and even governance systems. So strengthening that is a big challenge, and is going to be an important part of actually looking at the implementation of SDG 11, and in fact, many of the other SDGs. mayors from smaller cities have a very intelligent way of dealing with these questions, but they have serious challenges. Enrique asks interesting question of how to convince government officials to lead these goals as public policy. Now the question is, who's doing the convincing? In some senses, the question is of what kind of government officials at the national government level or within metropolitan and local governments. So in some senses, national governments across the world have, fortunately, unfortunately for themselves, at the highest level agreed that these goals are something that we've all got to work towards. The question, of course, is how long will it take for prime ministers and presidents to convince their ministers and their bureaucrats and their public agencies that this is very critical at national level. And in order to deliver them at national level, we really have to strengthen local and regional governments, the people who are actually delivering these goals, whether it's education or healthcare or dealing with poverty, and sort of bringing them into the process. So this is going to be an interesting contest in some senses that I see between national governments saying, look, local governments have to actually just focus on implementation, and in discussions across the world, like I mentioned in the earlier webcast, in Bogota, when we were talking to mayors and leaders from about, from 2,500 of them earlier last month, they're saying, look, we know how to do this. So there's going to be an interesting contest between the cities that are actually taking on these processes and running with them, with these goals, and national governments who may be a little bit behind in some cases, or in other cases are actually ahead. So, you take the case of California. California is actually pushing very far ahead of the federal government in Washington as far as the United States is concerned. In other places, cities are, where the action is actually happening. So in some cases, you don't require too much of convincing. In other cases, I think a lot of you are going to be very important in talking to your city government officials, trying to convince them that this actually works, that they can do things much more effectively if they're able to look at integration across scale, across sector, and of course, critically bringing in citizens and looking at stakeholder engagement in these processes. Are there good examples of active citizen participation to push for sustainable development? Of course they are. I mean, as I said last time around, a lot of what we're talking about is based on things that have happened dramatically in various parts of the world. So whether you look at processes of upgrading in Bangkok, where a whole range of colleagues will be talking about this later in the course of actually worked, or you look at how sewers and water supply services were actually transformed in one of the more challenged cities of the world, in Karachi, which is growing very rapidly, has a whole range of economic and sectarian questions, or you look at how communities in cities like Nairobi have dealt with these questions. We have and of course Latin American examples of are significant and dramatic. This is based on a whole range of empirical evidence. I think what we're trying to do here is to show you some of those elements. We probably pick up 4 or 5% of the remarkable things that are happening. There are a couple of thousand cities across the world that are actually involve citizens in participatory budgeting. In your part of the world, it may not be sort of something that's commonplace, but it's being dealt with and sorted out in cities in let's say at least 3 or 4 continents, and it's been done at scale. So that's one very interesting example of how you can involve citizens in taking decisions around what they consider important. It may not be in the entire budget, but it's happening in many places, and that's starting to change how things would process. Shabaz asks a question about key indicators for assessing a sustainable city. I think what you need to do is to go and look at the SDGs. So SDG 11, of course, deals with a whole range of things, but like Rafto's talks about in I think it's SDG 1.4, there is a focus on looking at tenure of security for a whole range of people, and that's sitting in a different space rather than otherwise. So the indicator set is in place. There was a revision that actually happened last week out of New York, and these are new things. People are testing them in different places. I think what we'll do is we'll put up links to a whole range of articles that we worked on this. The campaign for the Urban SG actually worked very extensively over a period of almost 2 years to try and help define these indicators. But what I would say as far as that's concerned is that there is a global indicator set, which is great and very interesting. The indicators that will be used at national level. But when we're looking at the particular context of a city, some cities will find, let's say, dealing with risk and resilience more important. So if you're in, let's say, in a country like Bangladesh, and you're sitting, along the coastline or an area that's exposed to flooding, your concerns will be very different compared to a city sitting in the Andes, which would also have risk that's important, but this different set of risk would actually be critical as far as that's concerned. Shravani asked a question about climate change, challenges of urbanization, etc., etc. And I think what you feel is that these are becoming more theoretical and elite, and are not dealt with by people on the grassroots. And they're dealt with governments, and people go off to great conferences. Now, to be fairly frank about that, the people who deal with the challenges of disasters, whether it's drought or flooding, in most of our countries, are not governments. Governments come in later, but the first responders, the people who deal with actual problems on the ground, and I've seen this in many parts of the world, including my own country, India, for a long, 20, 25 years or more than that, is that it is communities and individuals and households who respond to these questions. And in fact, the bulk of the risk is taken by them, because the bulk of the rebuilding and response is handled by them. There are very few governments in the world, including those in the high-income countries, that actually step in to solve these challenges. So this is a very live and real challenge for people on the ground. If you talk to farmers across the world, and I've had a little bit of opportunity to do that, they're actively responding to questions of drought and climate change. Okay, well, I would say, I should correct that, to climate variability, because climate change has not really started. What we expect to see in climate change is actually, a little bit away, and the challenges that we had with El Nino over this year are just climate variability in some senses. So grassroots responses are real, they're happening, and I think they're going to be the basis of a sustainable strategy to try and address these questions. So these are not theoretical questions. The elites may be less interested in them, and some people in the elites can maybe afford to deny that these things are happening. But for poor and vulnerable people across the world, these are real questions. They affect their livelihoods, they affect what happens to them in their everyday life. And I think, people and citizens, where they're active, really put pressure on their governments to actually respond to them. So yes, community-based mobilization is important. Yes, community-based disaster risk reduction is important, but it has to be within a larger frame, because there are a whole range of complexities that need to be addressed, from early warning systems. It's very difficult for a set of citizens to get together and put up an advanced radar system that will tell you that a cyclonic storm is going to actually come and hit you in a few days from now. That's something that governments and corporations are much better at doing. Amir Khan asked a question about dependence of cities on central governments that makes them weak. Absolutely. In fact, I try and deal with this. If you go back to your sessions, in fact, you go back to the early session, the first session, which talks about the development of our current frame of governance in many parts of the world, and the export of an idea that that was sort of created in Europe in the early 19th century, where in some senses the national governments took away the autonomy from cities. In Europe at that point of time, many cities were actually quite autonomous. In fact, there were a number of free cities. That was, in a sense, part of the legacy of history of the Middle Ages. There were a number of free cities in many parts of Europe, and the national government actually took away powers from them, brought them to the center, including powers of taxation, and that has been exported to many parts of the world through the process of colonization in the 19th and 20th century. So, our systems of governance that we have of cities in many parts of Africa, in a lot of Latin America, because Spanish and Portuguese influences are very strong, and in areas where the British Empire was strong, in many parts of Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia, even in Australia, these systems have been sort of embedded into how we think about cities. So effectively, when you look at taxation, for example, taxes are collected from citizens and enterprises, to put it very simply. They then very often go all the way up to the national governments, and then the national governments then transfer them to regional governments where they have them, or to cities. And what that means, of course, is that central governments have tremendous power in deciding what urban agendas are about. So I think one of the changes that we're seeing just now is that cities are becoming more and more autonomous. In some cases, they've been given greater freedom, and I think the process of how China has done that is very interesting. China the central government gave a lot of autonomy to provinces and cities to do a lot of things. That's creating a whole range of challenges for them at the moment. But that autonomy led to a whole range of innovations at the city level, and it depends on what we call the intergovernmental fiscal system, what the relationship between national, regional, provincial, and city governments is like, and how the resource flows actually play themselves out. But more than the flow of money, it's a question of political power, and that is something that is situated very often in the constitutions of countries. And those are difficult things to change, and they change when there's a fundamental shift in how cities and regions and countries are governed. And I think that is something that will play itself out if we have to try and address questions of sustainability. There's an old friend and colleague, an academic from New York called Benjamin Barber, who, if you're interested, you go to TED, you can hear his talk. He talks about how the world will be like when mayors rule the world. Now, I'm not sure that's going to happen immediately, or it may not even happen for a long period of time. But that's a counterfactual example of when cities become much more powerful. And you're seeing that more and more with large metropolitan cities, which have very large economies. London and New York are trillion-dollar economies. So they have a say in how the national governments work. And when you have private cities like Buenos Aires, or if you have a city that's as important as Johannesburg, or Mumbai, for example, for a long period of time, is a very important city in India. They actually carry a lot of clout if their political leaders are organized and their political systems are open to these kind of changes. Ryan asks a question about how do you think cities and urbanization will affect representative democracy in places like the US going forward? I mean, this is a question that's live at the current point of time. This is we can answer this question, I think, over the next year. Certainly, I think you should ask this question towards the end of the course, after President Trump actually takes over, and we see how the US is actually going to go forward. But both, if you look at how voting and sort of the politics of the electoral electoral college versus the popular vote is concerned. I mean, California, for example, is a classic example. Historically, California is a very large economy. It's maybe the 6th or 7th largest economy in the world. And knowing Governor Brown a little bit and his own positions on climate, he's really taken a very strong position on that. California has historically led the charge. So irrespective of who the governor was, things have been quite different. Now, the question that you're alluding to here of the US election being decided by rural citizens, this is an interesting thing. This is a question that comes in many parts of the world. In India, for example, our electoral systems overrepresent rural citizens, even though we're at 70-30, we're 68% rural, 32% urban here, because the boundaries of the electoral constituencies are based on the 1991 census. So, in spite of the fact that the country becomes more and more urban, in effect, part of the political deal was that there would be a overrepresentation of rural areas. So this is an interesting challenge in different parts of the world. It's also part of the politics of process and how power is organized. And this is a question I think you should be asking of colleagues in countries like South Korea, which are extensively urban, have a large private city, and have a very active democracy. The last election was really a pain in a sense to urban citizens actually being mobilized and coming forward and dealing with it. Or countries like Brazil, where urban citizens have had a very important role in sort of ending dictatorship and establishing democracy starting in the 80s, and then enabling the current context that you see. Similarly, you see all over in Egypt, in many other countries in North Africa, the role of citizens. So it's not only elections in which this is important, it's also a whole range of other processes. So governance is not only about the government, it's about a whole range of other stakeholders. and citizens have an important voice. And with the internet and a whole range of other processes, things are actually changing. Nishi asks a question of how to prevent ghost cities like those in China. Now, this is a question that I've often asked my Chinese colleagues. So, China has a particular form of governance in which there is both a strong central part in Beijing, but also a great deal of autonomy with the provinces and with cities. So part of the challenge, of course, is that the Chinese urbanization that we've seen happening since the early 1990s is the most rapid urbanization in history. 10, 15 million people actually becoming urban citizens within a dualistic system. Remember, China is very, very particular because of the hukou. People in rural areas cannot move to urban areas with all their entitlements unless they have to be registered. There are a whole range of challenges. That's actually changing at the moment because China recognizes just now that they've overbuilt on the eastern seaboard. That was part of the big sort of economic transformation that Deng Xiaoping brought starting in the late 1980s to essentially build Chinese economic activity along the eastern seaboard to be able to address global markets because port cities are much more effectively connected, and of course you were able to build out these corridors of economic expansion. And then you see other areas, especially in Western China, in Xinjiang and other provinces, growing much more slowly. And now, of course, in the last two plans, and especially the current plan, China is trying to rebalance its development. This is a key part of their sort of economic policy. So in the process of actually rapidly urbanizing, in some senses, mistakes are made. And especially if you're such an efficient country like China, you can build so quickly, you build 100,000 town, and then you find that people in the rural areas are unwilling to move into them. It's not very, very well economically connected. They're somewhere else. You do have these kind of sort of extraordinary impacts. In fact, in many other parts of the world, you have people living in informal settlements who would be very, very happy to live in these ghost cities, but are obviously in a different geography and you can't make them out. So this is, in a sense, I would say, an unexpected, unintended consequence of the rapidity of urban processes. And this is not the only country that's doing it, excepting that China does it at such a remarkable scale at the moment that it pops up at us. If you look at the development of, let's say, in the United States, as over the, let's say, 150 years from the 19th century onwards, you will find similar things. You find ghost villages or ghost towns because economic activity went away. You would find, that in areas where oil became a critical resource or where resource extraction is important, you find very rapidly urbanization happening, and then these things decaying and falling apart. Or in other parts of the world where you had areas that were major agricultural producing regions, you find with the collapse of agriculture that people would move out from the regions, and you'd find ghost towns. But China is very, very exceptional in the scale and the building that we're talking about. There's a question here about how one can address the question of urban regeneration as one tool of implementing the SDGs. Now, obviously urban regeneration can happen where cities exist and where cities have gone to seed in some senses. So this is a set of tools which developed very often in high-income cities to deal with inner-city neighborhood questions. They work in other parts of the world too, but the contexts are often very different. So one has to understand the economic and social context of a particular city. We will be talking later, it's been mentioned earlier, about in the first session there was Edgar Peterson talked about how the city of Johannesburg tried to use corridors to be able to enable urban regeneration and link up. And of course, Johannesburg has got a very particular city of apartheid and divisions, both economically and otherwise, between its communities and its geographies, to be able to enable urban regeneration. In other parts of the world, transit-oriented development has been used. Tokyo and Japan has used it quite effectively to try and regenerate particular areas that then have become depressed because of economic or other sort of social circumstances. So this is an area of considerable work, but as I said, it's only one tool that needs to be brought into play. Urban regeneration that destroys the historic core of a city is something that we would actually look at with some degree of suspicion, because you then will actually not only wipe out memory and an understanding of culture and processes, but you're actually dislocating the residents of the city, and their future residents from something that's a very important part of their heritage. This is an old debate that we have with colleagues in China, especially as cities are growing so rapidly. They have had wonderful urban cores, and as let's say in Beijing, you build ring road after ring road, and you're actually sort of disrupting the urban core. You find nothing to be able to relate to. Future generations or even the current generation would feel quite sad when they come back and they find no connection with what's actually happening in their lives and the history that is of maybe 500 or 1,000 years of urbanization in a particular location. Rakul asked a question about large-scale initiatives like smart cities, and whether they could fail because of lack of knowledge, and whether they could be done at a small scale. Of course, large experiments are risky, and because city experiments take a long time to find their feet or go to scale, obviously it makes sense to do things at a smaller scale. So even within a larger metropolitan area, this is what India is trying to do with its smart cities program. You would want to try out a new initiative at a neighborhood or a ward scale. But in some of our cities, our ward is a lot of people. It could be 150,000 people. It could be 500,000 people. So obviously, when you're trying out something new, you do want to try it out at a small scale. But then the question is, how do you enable to then, if you've got an innovation that actually works, how do you enable it to scale across the city? Otherwise, it becomes something that only rich people or particular communities are able to access. So apart from the question of knowledge, I think a really critical thing for us when we're looking at sustainable cities is how to insert into the DNA of the process the idea that we need millions of experiments and innovations, but eventually we have to take them and actually scale them. And some things are not scalable, or when they are scaled, they actually have outcomes which can be really harmful to particular communities and vulnerable people, or they could have outcomes that are really bad as far as the environment is concerned. So one of the questions that we have to deal with when we're dealing with planning and looking at the future and trying to address sustainability is how one links backwards from where we want to go to the current context, and look at who can win, who's going to actually win and lose, because most processes have negative impacts, and I think we need to take them into account as we're going forward. And one very effective way of doing that is to have wide-scale consultations. When people have a voice, they can often see what their interests are. Of course, one has to have an adequate platform where these political processes actually work. But that's one way of trying to deal with the small and the large. When we're dealing with infrastructure, for example, one of the core challenges we have is you can do upgrading in a particular community or a locality, but you need to connect that up with the citywide infrastructure. Otherwise, you don't actually get health benefits when we're talking about, let's say, sanitation systems. Or if you have a drainage system that works in one location, which actually is not connected to citywide drainage, you'd actually create a bottleneck in another location which is downstream. So we need to look at these things across scale, and that's, I think, a very important lesson for us. So cross-scalar engagement is difficult. It's not easy. Our systems are not designed to deal with them. I think we're going to encourage people like you to think about those questions and try and see how they can be dealt with. So there's a question from Sirajul about the challenges of urban agriculture and vertical farming. Now, urban agriculture is a reality in many parts of the world. It's just we don't recognize it, or it's practiced by people who are typically not sort of the elites in those areas. So urban agriculture is very important. In fact, the fact, and I've said this before, is that cities cannot survive on their own. They absolutely need to depend on villages, the countryside, smaller centers, market towns for the food that comes to them, especially large metropolitan cities, which sometimes have to move food from other continents, and that's what the global agribusiness is about, in order to feed themselves. So if we're able to transform our cities to integrate productive landscapes, instead of having segregated zones where you have work and let's say and play and green areas as sort of all separated out. Of course, you need a minimum amount of green areas and public spaces in most cities. If some of them actually become productive and help us not only to be able to feed people in urban areas, but perform other ecological functions, it's actually very important. And cities like Durban have done this pretty effectively, where you can even integrate something like a solid waste management system into the heart of the city, because after all, these wastes, especially organic waste, can be recycled, they can be reused, and they can be brought back as very important nutrients. So while you bring food into a city, those nutrients can actually be used to not only fertilize activity inside the city, and urban forestry is something that even cities like New York that actually have very, very little sort of green in them have become quite important. But also we can use those fertilizers to actually produce fruits and vegetables and a whole range of other processes. So vertical farming is one way of dealing with that. I would encourage more and more of us actually to start farming in whatever ways we can, whether it's on the balconies of our flats if we live in cities that are built up a lot, like in Singapore or in Southeast Asia or in some parts of China, or those of us who have access to land, to use the land most effectively and use it in a way that increases the biodiversity of our environments. Because soil is a very rich and a very, very important resource for us, and you can actually enable, and I've done this personally myself, enable soil health, and soil health is very critical for urban sustainability and urban agriculture. And it is from the soil that you're able to actually enable the growth of plants, to be able to sequester carbon in soils and a whole range of other things. So there are great opportunities for this, and they are wonderful places for young people to learn, for children to spend time, and of course they're critical places for livelihoods. In many of our cities, even now, a large number of people depend on these systems for their nutrition. And if you're poor and you have access to nutritional resources in your environment, you grow them. And that's a message that people bring from their villages, but also in the relationship with rural areas. Krishna asked a question about the line between theoretical approaches and practical execution. Now, this is also another classic dichotomy, that some people think and the other people do. Now, in practice, if the people who actually did things were able to write about them and talk about them like we're trying to do this now, and that would come back, and we would educate each other using that material, it would be fantastic, because practitioners actually hold a lot of the answers to the questions we're talking about. Sustainable development goals sound like a great and fancy thing, but in actual practice, there are hundreds of millions of people in the world who are actually doing these things in their everyday life. The challenge, of course, is that it's not joined up together, and very often it's not recognized, because many of these things happen in the informal economy, in community-based systems, and the formal systems and the large corporations don't necessarily always see this. The second thing, of course, is this idea that there would be some people who would think for the rest of society. Might have worked in an earlier world, but today, at least in my experience, is not the best way to approach innovation. And if you see some of the most innovative things that are happening in urban areas and otherwise, it is because there's a very close connection between theory building, which is very important, and practical execution. And all of us build theories about things. Children wouldn't be what they are and wouldn't be great learners if they actually didn't build theories about how things actually work. But they test them. The challenge is when the building of theories and the testing of them in practical execution, or in the real world, breaks down, because some people do the thinking and other people do the execution. And I think what we're trying to encourage in sustainable cities, and the way that communities and governments and a whole range of stakeholders come together, is to try and test these ideas. An idea may be wonderful in one location. You can theorize about certain forms of land tenure or certain forms of, let's say, public transportation in particular contexts, and they completely fail in others. So you can take a great theoretical idea and it may fail practically. And similarly, a very practical idea, if you do not understand the principles on which it's based and then translate that into another context, is only useful for some people. And I think we're talking about a range of universal practices here. Universal doesn't mean that everybody does the same thing and everything is homogeneous. It means that we're moving broadly in the same direction. We agree what the values are that are important, that that we should end urban poverty, for example. The approaches that we'd use in some parts of Russia would be very different to that you would use in, let's say, South Africa, and very different from what you'd use in Indonesia, or let's say in Pakistan or Nepal. So we need to be able to understand what these ideas are about and find ways of trying to apply them in our context. But the system, which we're trying to do just now using the internet and through education around the SDGs, should allow us to take that practical experience and bring that back and say, look, there's this wonderful idea that we have that comes out of Shanghai. Does it make sense for us to try and apply it to Quito or not? Or what are the parts of it that make sense? So I think we're trying to open up these discussions, and I think the wonderful thing about these experiences is that we can try and learn from each other in effective ways. Kula asked a question about do we have to shape cities or facilitate them? Well, I mean, if we accept that cities are systems of systems and they have dynamics of their own, they are self-organizing. The question is, what shapes cities, the people or the cities themselves? So, we ask this as far as buildings are concerned in urban design, and as we try to deal with metropolitan systems or regional systems, of course, people shape cities, but the cities also shape people, and they shape them in very interesting ways. I mean, the culture of a city shapes how people think and what they find is interesting and what is important. So, in some cities, it would be completely a sacrilege to actually give up green and public spaces and let individuals or families actually take them over. In other cities, that's exactly what happens, because that consciousness is either not active or not very useful. So, of course, we have to both shape cities and facilitate them to happen. The challenge, of course, is that cities are not beings on their own. We tend to anthropomorphize them, and maybe I'm doing that myself. But it is people and communities and institutions that have to do this. So we need to be able to develop a vocabulary and a process to understand and unbundle these processes, to be able to figure out how the facilitation can happen. Who are the agents of change? Who are the actors that should be part of these conversations? And then that sort of answers the question of who's responsible of driving all these transformations. And the answer is relatively simple: it's all of us. But in some parts of the world, some formations, and Edgar dealt with this in his session that he dealt with as far as power is concerned. Some particular agency and agents have more power than others. Some have invisible power. In some parts of the world, deals are made between elites and let's say urban governance or governments, and that happens behind closed doors. In other places, it all happens in the open. So it's a question of how we become more and more mature in how we govern our systems. Like you said, again, quoting Foucault about power. Power is not a negative thing. It's actually something that's very positive as far as urban areas are concerned. The question is, do we all have voice? Do we all have agency? Do we use that agency to be able to achieve these commonly accepted things that we think should happen everywhere? And if we do that, then why are we not able to address things that we agreed on, like ending poverty, like providing universal access to healthcare or education? And this is true. These are crises even in some of the most advanced economies of the world. How do you actually do these things? Inequality is something that is as bad, or in some cases worse, in high-income countries than they are in low-income countries. So I think these are really important questions, and we have to try and find answers to them as effectively as we can. There's a question there about how do we influence knowledge in institutions? And you take an example of IHS. What influence do we have on planning and implementation? Well, that's I guess part of the reason why we're having this conversation. So individuals can have great ideas. Interest groups can have not only great ideas, but ways to actually implement them in practice. But it is our institutions that help actually define how change does or does not happen. Institutions have both roles. They have a role, or they have a facet of their functioning, which is to actually maintain the status quo. And a classic institution of that kind is a bureaucracy. The bureaucracy in many parts of the world is focused on trying to keep the system the way it is. So stability is a core function that the bureaucracy provides. But if you need rapid change and innovation, bureaucracies are not very good to deal with that. So the question then is, if you want to influence a bureaucracy, how do you do it? Do you do it by influencing the political establishment or the political class that influences bureaucracy? Or do you actually start working with the middle cadre of institutions and help them see how they can work enable their work more efficiently and more effectively? Do you actually use pressure through social movements to make change? Do you re-educate people or change the curriculum, like colleagues have been trying to do in many parts of Africa? there's a new curriculum that's rolling itself out through planning schools across Africa. Will that be a way that's working? I think the answer is going to be different in different contexts. But obviously, one of the core ways of actually making that change, and this is what Goal 16 is about these partnerships. First of all, transforming the way the institutions look at themselves and look at the challenges they're dealing with. So the challenge of integration across sectors is about how does one deal with the silos that governance and even the private sector is organized around. So there's a complete fracture between land use and employment, between employment and transportation. So the putting of that together requires new knowledges. And these new knowledges are not enough to have in conversations that we're having just now, but they have to be institutionalized. And they have to become the rules and practices that govern how the institutions function. And we have to educate people in our educational institutions to enable that to happen for the next generation of professionals, of citizens, of people to actually populate and manage these institutions. So of course, institutional change is very critical. So, understanding how regime change takes place, there's a huge literature of how this works, from institutional economics to a whole range of other things, is quite important, because that's what makes the change in the long run. And it is a change in these rules and these ways of looking at things and these goals that actually makes that possible. There's a question about sustainable finance. Now we're going to be dealing with this question a little bit further down the road. We've touched on it a little bit talking about public finance, but we have some very interesting people. I think two of the leading economists in the world who talk about this. There's Mike Cohen, who talks about this further down. I think way down in week maybe 10, 11. There's Jeff Sachs, who's the UN Secretary General's advisor on sustainable development, who talks about this question. So I'm going to leave that a little bit further down the line. I mean, we can't address everything up front, or you'll get indigestion apart from other things. And then there's I think a fascinating question to end with, and that is, Sharif says, what do I do after this course? I feel I have a huge responsibility to shoulder towards my community. I'm hoping that you came to the course precisely because you feel that you can do something, not only for your community and your neighborhood, but for your city and your country. And of course, through that, you would help make change as far as that's concerned. I think this course will enable you to try and understand where the world is going, how interesting and simple and complex it is, how people are actually working on real solutions in different places, and from what people are doing otherwise, from what some of us are able to help you sort of get a perspective on, you will become personally a lot clearer about what is the individual and the professional role that you may play in making these changes happen. And you can choose then to work inside or outside government. I have really no idea of what you actually do. It would be wonderful to have a conversation on that on let's say on the community chat or otherwise. But I think this is really what we're trying to do here. We're trying to enable people to find what spaces work best for them, because your own personal and professional goals have to align with that of the community. Otherwise, sustainability is not about some abstract thing that happens somewhere else. It's about doing things on the ground in very practical ways, using ideas and experiences that come from past generations, come from other communities, and people that we often do not hear. I think that's what we're hoping to bring together with us. So I think we're very glad that you asked this question, and I think anything that we can do to help take this forward as a community, and it's not only you and me, it's a whole range of us who are there across the world who can make each of us succeed in what we're doing. We'd be happy to provide. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope this was useful, and we'll continue this conversation. There will be other colleagues who come in other webcasts over the next few weeks. Stay with us, and yeah, go back to your sessions and have fun. I mean, I think we're learning as much as you are in this process, and I hope you're able to work with each other on these very interesting projects in different cities, because the real engagement starts on the ground, at least in my experience. I mean, ideas are wonderful, we expose you to them, but if you're able to make a little change in a small thing over the next 2 or 3 or 4 weeks or months, you can start sharing that not only with your communities, but with people on this process. A little thing that you're able to do. So all the best for that, and it's wonderful being with you.